In Belanglo State Forest, Australia, there's a pretty chilling account of the exploits of a serial killer named Ivan Robert Marko Milat. At the time, he became known as a person to be feared even in New South Wales, where he was called backpacker murderer, because he specialized in targeting backpackers who wanted to explore or travel. He knows that towns and cities in Australia are far apart, so hitchhiking is a great option for backpackers on a budget. He usually disguises himself as a friendly driver and offers hitchhiking to backpackers. When they accept his advances, he drives to a remote area, then shows his ugly face, pulls out a pistol or knife, and kidnaps them. For those couples who were unlucky enough to cross paths with him, his behavior was even more heinous. He would sexually assault the women in front of the male victim, and then end their lives with extreme violence, such as slashing, shooting, strangling, beating, and beheading. His crimes not only resulted in the deaths of 7 innocent people, but also had a significant impact on Australia's backpacker culture. In the 1920s, a lot of Croatians left their homeland because of the economy. Saint Ivan Marko Milat was one of them. He was young at the time. Then he gave himself the English name Stephen and wanted to move to Australia, which was looking for a lot of workers to help with construction and industry after the war. He was accepted as a European immigrant under the White Australia policy, which was based on racial discrimination. He then worked on a wharf in Sydney. Around 1938, at the age of 36, he met 18-year-old Margaret Elizabeth Piddleston. They dated for a while and then got married. They initially lived on a makeshift farm in Bosley Park, 36 kilometers west of Sydney. They lived in poverty, but they had 14 children together during their lifetime. On an ordinary Wednesday, December 27, 1944, at the Crown Street Women's Hospital in New South Wales, they welcomed the birth of their 5th child, Milat, who would go on to commit serial murders more than 40 years later. Stephen works on the docks, working 10 hours a day for a meager salary to support his family, and the work on the docks is so tiring that he can't get off work until late at night. So he drinks a lot, wanting to rely on alcohol to anesthetize his brain and forget about the troubles of life. But the dangers of alcohol are so serious that he often beats his wife and children when he is drunk. His wife Piddleston was also quick-tempered, but she only took it out on her kids. Her son Boris said in an interview that his mother was beaten by Stephen at least once a week. Once, after being beaten, his mother got angry and hit him once with a knife. He doesn't remember why he was hit, but the scars are still visible today. Later on, Piddleston started a tomato plantation to make some extra money. The kids also worked on the plantation to help pay for school. It's worth noting that, despite their poverty and difficult relationship, Stephen and Piddleston valued education, and they sent all of their children to Catholic schools. The violence and poverty really affected the family a lot, but the biggest problem was the children's psychoeducation. There were 10 boys out of 14 children, and most of them had attracted the attention of the local police because of their habitual use of knives and guns, as well as their frequent target shooting in the yard in the afternoons. It's possible that Milat was born with a criminal inclination, but it's also possible that it was the influence of his family. His older brother Boris, the only one in the family who spoke out against Milat, has commented on him. He said that Milat displayed antisocial and psychotic behaviors from an early age. For example, he cut a dog in half with a machete when he was a child, which led to him being sent to a boarding school. At 17, he was sent to a juvenile detention center for burglary. One report said that Milat, at 17, told Boris he'd accidentally shot a cab driver during a gun operation. The driver was paralyzed from the waist down, but Milat wasn't even arrested. An innocent man was convicted and served 5 years. As he got older, Milat's offenses became more serious, and he spent more time in prison. At 19, he was also involved in a store robbery. A year later, he was arrested and sentenced to 18 months for breaking into a house. Even after going to prison, his behavior didn't improve. A month after his release, he was arrested for stealing a vehicle and sentenced to 2 years. After his release, he was sentenced to 3 years for burglary. It's possible that some criminals make behavioral and psychological improvements and corrections after spending time in prison. However, for Milat, crime was just a part of his repertoire. On April 7, 1971, he abducted 2 young female hitchhikers, both 18 years old, at knife point near the Liverpool train station. He then drove outside of the city limits, waiting until he got to a place where there were fewer people around. There, he raped one of his victims. Fortunately, though, the women managed to break free and escape when Milat stopped at a gas station to buy a coffee. It seems Milat was too lazy to escape his pursuers. He was arrested by the police later that night and charged with rape and armed robbery. While he was waiting for his trial, he got involved in a series of robberies with some of his brothers. Then he left his shoes at the Gap, which is Sydney's famous suicide place, and pretended to take his own life. At this point, Milat was thought to be dead, but in 1974 he was arrested by police at the hospital after his mother was rushed there with a heart attack. The police think that at that time, Milat fled to Queensland and Victoria, then flew to New Zealand, where he lived for 2 years before the New Zealand police suspected him of using a false passport, so he's sneaking back to Australia. Since he was caught, the trial continued in 1971. However, with the help of a family lawyer, John Marsden, the charges against him for robbery, kidnapping, and rape were dropped due to insufficient evidence presented by the prosecutor. In 1975, he got a job as a truck driver for the Roads and Traffic Authority of New South Wales. This job helped him plan his murders because he got to know the roads around him and the places that hardly anyone would pass by while he was working. One of the most interesting things is that a government department would allow a criminal who kept committing crimes to work for them. In 1977, Milat tried to rape and murder 2 women hitchhiking from Liverpool to Canberra. Thankfully, the women escaped, but they didn't report the incident until the backpacker murders made the news. In 1983, Milat met Karen Duck, who was 16 at the time and pregnant with her cousin's child. They married in 1984 and had a daughter. However, due to domestic violence issues, Duck left him in 1987. The two were officially divorced in October 1989. Later at Milat's trial, Duck described him as a gun nut and spoke of how he had once shot a kangaroo during a visit to Belonglo State Forest. 19-year-old James Gibson and 19-year-old Deborah Everest were a young couple from Melbourne who were eager to explore and travel. On December 30th, 1989, they planned to attend a music festival in Albury. They went to Sydney first and stayed for a while in a backpackers hostel near the city centre. After checking out, they tried to hitchhike to Albury, but for some reason they just up and disappeared along the way. The next day, a bushman found Gibson's camera on the road in Galston Gorge, north of Sydney. It was the only clue to their disappearance. On October 5th, 1993, a man looking for firewood found suspected human bones in a particularly remote area of Belonglo. Then he returned to the scene with the police. They found 2 victims, identified as Gibson and Everest. Gibson's skeleton had 8 stab wounds, one of which severed his upper spine, and stab wounds in his back and chest pierced his heart and lungs. Everest had been beaten brutally, suffering fractures to his skull and jaw, and stab wounds to his forehead and back. Life has voices, especially for outgoing, adventurous Simone Loretta Schmidl, who embarks on a journey alone, falling into Milat's trap in a desolate forest far from home, and becoming one of the indomitable dead souls in his hands. She left Sydney at around 8:15 a.m. on January 20th, 1991, an unusual Sunday. The 21-year-old was from Regensburg, Bavaria, Germany, and she and her mother had a plan to go on a 6-week caravanning trip together, but until then she needed to hitchhike to Melbourne alone. Her friend Jeanette Mueller, who's staying with her, warned her never to do that alone. In fact, Simone and Mueller had originally hitchhiked around Australia and New Zealand for a few weeks, so she didn't take Mueller's warnings to heart, but just in case, she took a knife with her. Simone left the house and traveled on a bus for 15 kilometers to the Hume Highway in Liverpool, where she planned to hitchhike, and then arrive at Melbourne Airport in 4 days' time to meet her mother, who had arrived from Munich. By this time, on the Casula Highway near Liverpool, southwest of Sydney, Milat had stopped his silver 4x4, having already murdered at least 2 people, and Simone had become his next victim. Her body was found on November 1st, 1993, in the Belonglo State Forest, about 40 meters from a jungle trail known as Miner's Despair. An autopsy revealed that she had suffered multiple stab wounds, including one that severed her spine, leaving her paralyzed, before she suffered the final fatal stab wound. Gabor Neugebauer, 21-year-old, and Anja Habscheid, 20-year-old, a German couple, came to Australia in 1991 to start their backpacking trip. On December 26th, they planned to hitchhike from Sydney to Adelaide and then Darwin, from where they would fly back to Munich. It was a journey of more than 4,000 kilometers. Gabor's father told the police that the last time he spoke to his son, Gabor sounded very upset and mentioned twice that he and Anja wanted to leave Australia, which was the last message they left. Gabor's father and Anja's brother traveled to Australia to look for them, but drove back and forth several times on the way without finding any clues. It wasn't until November 4th, 1993, that they were found in a remote area of Belonglo State Forest. Gabor was found with 6 bullets in his head, while Anja had been decapitated. Despite extensive searches, her skull has not yet been recovered. Joanne Walters, 22-year-old, and Carolyn Clark, 21-year-old, were backpackers from the UK who wanted to hitchhike through New South Wales and onto Victoria to pick fruit. In April 1992, they were traveling from Sydney and were passing through Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales when they met Milat. He was very well disguised. He had a kindly expression on his face and chatted very nicely with the two girls as they drove along. However, Milat's true colors were soon revealed as he pulled off the road onto a remote track and pulled out a handgun to threaten the two girls and kidnap them. On September 19, 1992, two joggers found a decomposed body partially hidden in the forest. The next day, the police found a second body about 30 meters away from the first. The victims were Walters and Clark. Walters had 15 stab wounds on her body, including her chest, neck, and back. The stab wounds on her back were severe enough to paralyze her, and her pants were undone. However, due to the badly decomposed body, the police were unable to determine whether she was sexually assaulted or not. In addition to multiple stab wounds on her body, Clark was shot 10 times in the head. The police believe that she may have been used by the murderer as a target for shooting practice. On October 14, 1993, the New South Wales Police formed a task force called Task Force Air, made up of more than 20 detectives and analysts. At first, they thought the crimes might have been committed by multiple killers because most of the victims appeared in pairs and were killed in different ways and buried separately. On November 5th, the New South Wales government increased the reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the perpetrator of the series of killings to 500,000 Australian dollars. A few days later, they were contacted by Paul Onions, a backpacker from the United Kingdom. He said he was traveling in Australia when he accepted an offer to hitchhike with a man who called himself Bill. The route was from Liverpool Station to Mildura, south of Mittagong, less than a kilometer from Belanglo. Bill pulled out a revolver and some rope to rob Paul, but Paul managed to escape and flagged down Joanne Berry of Canberra, who was passing by. They reported the incident to Bowler's police, including the assailant, his vehicle, and license plate number. Over the next few months, the Task Force Air used link analysis to narrow the list of suspects down from 230 to 32, including Milat. On February 26, 1994, they started keeping an eye on Milat's place on Cinnabar Street in Eagle Vale. Not long after that, the police found out that Milat had sold his silver Nissan patrol car not long after Clark and Walters were found. They also found out that Milat had been out of work for a few days after the attack. His acquaintances had told the police about his obsession with weapons before Paul came to Australia to help with the investigation. On May 5, 1994, Paul identified Milat as the man who had been hitchhiking and tried to shoot him. On May 22nd, Milat was arrested at the home on robbery and weapons charges related to the attack on Paul. Police then found a variety of weapons in his home, including one .22 caliber rifle, parts of one .22 caliber rifle matching the type used in the murder, a Browning pistol, and a Bowie knife, as well as items belonging to several of the victim, and a residence belonging to Milat's mother and his 5 brothers was also searched, and more items belonging to the victims were found. He showed up in court on May 23rd, but he didn't enter a plea. On May 31st, he was charged with 7 more backpacker murders. On June 28th, Milat fired his family's attorney James Marsden and looked for a new lawyer to pay for his defense. Meanwhile, Milat's brothers Richard and Walter were on trial for weapons, drugs, and stolen items found on their property. His committal hearing on the murders began on October 24th and continued through December 12th, during which more than 200 witnesses appeared. Based on the evidence, he was remanded in custody until June 1995. On March 26, 1996, his trial got underway in the New South Wales Supreme Court in Sydney. He was prosecuted by Mark Tedeschi. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Milat reportedly always believed he would be found innocent. In a 2004 telephone recording made for the ABC program Australian Story, Milat explained why he believed he would be found not guilty at trial. "My basic defense at trial is not me. I don't know who did it. They're going to prove I'm guilty, not me to prove I'm innocent." His defense team argued that even though there was evidence, there wasn't any proof that Milat was guilty, and tried to make other members of his family, particularly Richard, take the blame. 145 witnesses gave testimony, including members of Milat's family who tried to provide alibis. On June 18th, Milat testified in person. After 18 weeks of testimony, the jury found Milat guilty of murder on July 27, 1996. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each count, as well as 6 years for attempted murder, false imprisonment, and robbery. On his first day in prison, Milat was attacked by another inmate. On May 16, 1997, he conspired with convicted drug dealer and former Sydney City Councillor George Savas to escape from prison. However, the plan ultimately failed, and George was found hanged in his cell the next day. Milat was subsequently transferred to the maximum security section of the Goulburn Correctional Center. In November 1997, Milat asked the court to reconsider his conviction because he felt his right to legal representation had been violated, as established in Dietrich v. the Queen. However, the Court of Criminal Appeal of New South Wales rejected his appeal. In 2004, Milat filed an application with the High Court of Australia for permission to appeal on new grounds. This application for leave was also ultimately rejected, upholding the decision of the Court of Criminal Appeal to dismiss his initial appeal. On October 27, 2005, in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, Milat's final avenue of appeal was denied. 2 other applications were also rejected in 2006, and one in November 2011 was similarly rejected. In the last years of his life, Milat told Australian Story that he didn't think his family was involved in the 7 murders. Milat had previously self-harmed in 2001 when he swallowed razor blades, staples, and other metal objects. In May 2011, Milat went on a 9-day hunger strike to get a PlayStation, but was unsuccessful. In May 2019, Milat was transferred to Prince of Wales Hospital in Randick, where he was diagnosed with advanced esophageal cancer. After finishing his treatment, he was transferred to Long Bay Correctional Center to continue serving his sentence. On August 9, 2019, Milat was transferred to a secure treatment unit at Prince of Wales Hospital again. He passed away on October 27th at 4:07 a.m. from esophageal and stomach cancers in the hospital wing of Long Bay Correctional Center. Before he passed away, Milat wrote a letter to his family asking the NSW government to pay for his funeral. The NSW Minister for Corrections, Anthony Roberts, turned down the request. Instead, his body was cremated, and the costs will be fully reimbursed from his prison account. In a statement, NSW police said that in Milat's final days, their officers visited him 8 times in prison and the hospital in an attempt to get him to confess. However, Milat did not confess. The police statement said that they used different tactics each time, including different combinations of detectives and taped interviews with the victim's family. However, Milat didn't provide any new information to the police during his interrogation. Although he never made a formal confession after his death, he is said to have previously admitted to his mother, who was close to him, that he was responsible for the backpacker murders. Milat was charged with 7 murders, but the police thought he might have been involved in more than that. In 1993, Task Force Air started looking into the unsolved deaths and disappearances of young people across the state. They compared Milat's known way of working and the victims he targeted to these cases. Based on the striking similarities in the way he operated, Task Force Commander Clive Small concluded that the 3 unsolved murders were probably committed by Milat. On February 26, 1971, 20-year-old Karen Rowland drove to a motel in Canberra with her sister. They both drove different cars, and a few hours later, her sister arrived at her destination while she disappeared. Later that night, her car was found on a remote back road. Milat supposedly bragged to a colleague about murdering someone and burying the body under a bush while working in Liverpool. On May 3, 1971, Karen's remains were found 15 meters from the sidewalk at the air crash memorial at Fairborn Pines Plantation, near Canberra, her cause of death unknown. Peter Letcher, an 18-year-old unemployed youth, disappeared while hitchhiking back to his parents' home in Bathurst on November 13, 1987. His remains were found on January 21, 1988, by bushwalkers on a woodland trail near the Jenolan Caves tourist attraction. His body was found lying face up in a small ditch filled with leaves and branches, with a handcuff on his hand. He had been shot 5 times in the head and stabbed repeatedly in the back. Milat's ex-wife said that a few days before Letcher disappeared, he took her on a trip to the Jenolan National Forest to see a dirt road and a pine plantation. On September 6, 1991, Diane Pinocchio, 29-year-old, went to the Lake George Hotel in Bendale. Before she left, she told a friend that she planned to hitchhike back to Quimbine. She left the motel by herself and started walking towards the Kings Highway around 11 p.m. On November 13, 1991, 2 Forestry Commission employees found a person wrapped in pine boughs and lying face down in the Turrigonda State Forest, about 40 kilometers south of Bingandora and southwest of Canberra. It was Pinocchio. She was wearing just her underwear and pants. She'd also suffered a spinal cord injury, which meant that even if she hadn't died, she'd have been completely paralyzed. In November 2010, Matthew, Milat's grandson, and his friend Cohen Klein attacked 17-year-old David Alcterloni in Belonglo State Forest. Matthew used a double-headed axe, and Cohen recorded the attack on his cell phone. They were sentenced to 43 and 32 years in prison, respectively, for murder in 2012. On July 18, 2005, Milat's former lawyer John Marsden made a statement at the end of his life, claiming that Milat, with the help of his sister Shirley Sawyer, had killed 2 British backpackers who, if nothing else, may have been Walters and Clark.